From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Trump announcing a major investment in the U.S. by Taiwan Semiconductor on the eve of tariffs on Canada and Mexico taking effect.
Tomorrow, tariffs 25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico.
We'll discuss with economist Joe Lavorgna, former chief economist of the National Economic Council in Donald Trump's first term.
President Trump also says Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky does not want peace. We'll have more on the escalating rhetoric on Friday after Friday's Oval Office meeting and ahead of tomorrow's presidential address to Congress with Jane Harman, former chair of the Commission on National Defense Strategy.
And we'll talk with Republican Congressman Frank Lucas of Oklahoma about his expectations for the speech and chances of a possible government shutdown only 11 days from now.
Thanks for joining us on this Monday evening. And we begin with President Trump making it clear while speaking at the White House this afternoon, tariffs on the U.S.'s three largest trading partners will hit or be raised tomorrow.
On the tariffs, is there any room left for Canada and Mexico to make a deal before midnight? And should we expect those Chinese tariffs, the extra 10%, to take effect tomorrow?
No room left for Mexico or for Canada. No, the tariffs, they're all set. They go into effect tomorrow. China also had an additional 10, so it's 10 plus 10.
Markets sank to their lows of the day following the news. The S&P 500 down almost 2%. Its worst sell-off of the year. Let's turn now to Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick for more on today's market reaction. Pretty severe, Romaine. What's the market telling us?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the worst sell-off of the year. That's not how the day started, Joe. We came actually into this market. It looked like we were going to have an extension of that dip, buy, and rebound that we had on Friday. Two things happened. First, we got economic data around 10 a.m. this morning that showed the manufacturing sector in this economy close to contraction and prices going into those factory inputs spiking to the highest in about 2.5 years. Now, manufacturing is only about 10% of our economy, so the market kind of took that a bit in stride. But once we got to that big announcement in the middle of the day, which was ostensibly at the White House, supposed to be about this investment in the U.S. chip sector, the questions turned to tariffs. And as you just said here, no room for negotiation. Joe, if you just go down the list of the companies, the major companies in the U.S. that have outsized exposures to cross-border sales, meaning to Mexico, to Canada, to China, they were all down in a big way. General Motors down 4% here on the day. Ford down 2%. Companies like Apple losing about 2% on the day. Big chip makers like NVIDIA down 8-9% here on the day. The list goes on and on. You can go through industrials like Caterpillar. You can go through solar makers like Sunrun. You can go through oil and gas companies like Oklo and like Constellation Energy. All of those names got hit hard as investors really sought to blunt their potential exposure to what could be the most significant and most broad-based set of tariffs that the United States has ever imposed since the 1920s.
Well, and on our three largest trading partners to boot, Romaine, walk us through what we saw in FX as well.
You saw a huge spike in the dollar and dollar strength relative to the Canadian dollar, relative to the Mexican peso. You also saw strengthening in the yen, believe it or not, as a lot of people sought out some degree of safe haven. And this becomes the big question here, Kaylee. We've been talking a lot here on my program, The Close, about what the actual economic impact of all of this is. Do we have the upper hand? Trump says so, and there's no doubt about it. We are the world's largest economy. We have the cards, as Trump would say, but that doesn't necessarily mean we aren't going to be affected by the fallout from this. And that's what the market seems to be preparing for right now, Kaylee.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you so much. Asking the very question that we'll now ask of our next guest. Joe Lavorgna is with us, chief U.S. economist at SMBC Nikko Securities America, also former chief economist for the National Economic Council in the first Trump White House. Joe, welcome back to Balance of Power. Romaine just phrased it perfectly. We wonder what the ultimate economic impact of these tariffs actually will be. Clearly, the market is freaked out today. Is that justified?
The market's worried. It's understandable because the tariffs are significant, and in some ways they need to be, Kaylee. If the president is serious about reindustrializing the U.S. manufacturing base, then tariffs are a very important tool that will be used to do that. The markets also, I think, were not believing the president was serious with these tariffs. So today might just reflect the fact that for much, I think, of this year, there was thoughts that they would actually never be implemented or be watered down. So I think today was really a reality check for many investors.
No room left was the line today, Joe. At least until tomorrow, right? These are going to take effect, the president says. But couldn't you envision a world in which certain conditions are met? Maybe Canada, Mexico match tariffs against China, as Scott Bessent suggested on Bloomberg on Friday. And then he could take credit for a 1,000-point rally come Wednesday afternoon. Does that sound like a possibility?
It sounds very much like a possibility. The president, he did write a best-selling book, Art of the Deal. He does know how to negotiate. And I imagine at some point there will be a negotiation and these tariffs perhaps will be significantly lower. Remember, on the campaign trail, he talked about 10 to 20% tariffs. So I see the prospects or the possibility, as you alluded to, Secretary Bessent had said, in lowering tariffs to actually have a deal at some point.
Well, and of course, tomorrow is just one deadline, Joe. He's also announced a laundry list of what he says will be implemented on April 2nd, from agricultural products to autos to reciprocal tariffs on other countries. And it does raise a question of the timeline here. Earlier today, we spoke with Liz Pancotti of the Groundwork Collaborative about the potential inflationary impact of Trump's proposed tariffs and specifically how the timeline affects it. This is what she said.
If you expected a one-time increase in prices, or if that was your goal, you might implement all the tariffs all at once in a very clear fashion on a very clear set of goods. Instead, we're getting, delays on this, layers on this, changing in decisions at the last minute. I don't see how this is a one-time price increase, especially with where consumer and business sentiment is. I think this is likely to spiral, and we're likely to see downstream effects for months to come as the Trump administration continues to play games with the implementation of these policies.
And Joe, given you've been on this program with that one-time price increase notion before, how does the timeline influence that?
Well, I mean, even on the one price adjustment, I believe it may have been Secretary Bessent at one point said that there was a possibility that if it was a 1 point, it could be phased in. Certainly, I know that was talked about. So I'm not really sure whether it's, there's really two issues. One is, are you negotiating on a bilateral or reciprocal basis, which the president is doing, or are you doing something more uniform with different tariff tiers, which is what I think I read he suggested more when he was campaigning. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. I mean, in the sense that there needs to be some minimal level of tariffs if you want to reindustrialize to attract capital back to the U.S. Remember, Kayleigh, at the same time, you're cutting taxes, keeping energy costs low, and putting business-friendly regulation in place. The fact that it might seem to some that it's disjointed actually could be a positive in that it's a gradual increase. It's not a big one-off 25% adjustment. Moreover, it seems to me if you're going along different products and you're doing it more bespoke, there's also an opportunity for negotiation. But as I said at the outset, this is still very early stages. I expect tariffs will be used effectively, but the rates we're seeing now aren't necessarily the rates that we're going to have in perpetuity, because I do think there'll be some sort of deal. What it looks like, hard to say, but I do think there'll be a deal.
What's the president need to say about this tomorrow night? Joe, so much of this has to do with perception. We saw a poll from CBS YouGov over the weekend. 80% of adults think Trump should focus on the economy and inflation. And I realize there's a lot of overlap here. And he did, of course, campaign on tariffs as his favorite word in the dictionary. But if rising prices is the worry here, how does the president straddle that in his address to a joint session and to the nation tomorrow night?
So on the tariffs, again, the tariffs are a price level adjustment. The inflation that we had over the past several years was excessive spending that the Fed monetized. We saw that in money and credit growth, which exploded to the upside. So tariffs are a price level adjustment, which, Joe, can be offset if oil prices decline. In fact, oil is a much bigger weight in the economy than tariffs. So even if you're looking at a higher price level adjustment on tariffs, if oil prices move lower, that will provide an offset. And in fact, if you look at where oil was in January, we were at $80 a barrel. This afternoon, we were under 70. So that's important. But Trump does have an economic record that he could show to people. The Trump 1.0 is pretty successful. And tomorrow, I think he'll talk about how he needs to really try to continue the policies had in the first administration by having rising middle-class wages. Real household median income rose about $7,000 in the first 3 Trump years, which was basically more than what had been flat income growth over the prior 16. That's, to me, is the message he's likely to highlight, and how he's really for the common folk and, the forgotten person, so to speak, that has basically had their job offshore and outsourced to China and elsewhere.
Always look forward to the conversation, Joe. Thanks for coming back. Joe Lavorgna, Chief U.S. Economist, SMBC, Nikko Securities America. We thank you, and we'll have special coverage of Donald Trump's address to the joint session of Congress tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Eastern time, so join us. Coming up, we'll have a look at the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine following last week's heated Oval Office exchange between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. Jane Harman, former Congresswoman, former chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, weighs in next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
Is the Ukraine minerals deal now dead, or can it be revived?
Well, I'll let you know. We're making a speech. You probably heard about it tomorrow night, so I'll let you know tomorrow night. But no, I don't think so. I think it's a great deal.
President Trump with the deep tease, speaking earlier today ahead of his speech to a joint session of Congress tomorrow, making clear the Ukraine minerals deal is not dead, even after Friday's heated exchange with Ukrainian President Zelensky in the Oval Office. Joining us now with the latest on this, following a weekend of rhetoric, Bloomberg's national security reporter Courtney McBride. It's great to see you. Courtney, if you were reading Truth Social, you might think otherwise today. He was calling out Zelensky for suggesting it could be a very long time before the war comes to an end. He said this is not a guy who wants peace, yet making clear to reporters today, and I guess this is the part we'll take seriously, that the minerals deal is still on.
Sure. I mean, the president has said that this is a good deal for the United States, and so that, if the two sides can come to terms, that it's still in the offing. Mm-hmm. But yes, there certainly have been some heated exchanges on social media. President Zelensky also making his own case and declining to apologize for, as you said, a heated exchange on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and certainly this colored the tenor of conversation European leaders had in the UK yesterday. 20 countries gathered on the path forward, suggesting Europe does need to step up to the plate here. That's what the president wants to see, right? Trump is hoping Europe will shoulder this burden. Is there a world in which Europe can actually do this and the U.S. can say, all right, you guys got it covered. We don't actually need to get involved?
Well, I mean, certainly the administration has been signaling and outright saying that Europe needs to do more. I mean, even since the first Trump administration, and the president likes to point to increases in spending by NATO allies since then. But I think a lot of analysts would say that there needs to be a bit of a transition period, and that so that Europe can't necessarily assume the entire burden cold turkey, if you will. And so there's some question and perhaps some backroom maneuvering to try to figure out the appropriate transition.
All right, Bloomberg's Courtney McBride, thank you so much. And we want to add another voice to our conversation now and turn to Jane Harman, former chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, also former Democratic Congresswoman from California. Jane, welcome back to Balance of Power. As we consider what Donald Trump might actually have to say about this when he addresses a joint session tomorrow night, are you optimistic that this can be salvaged, that he may indeed say a deal can still be done?
I have no idea what he'll say, but I am optimistic that it can and will be salvaged. Signing this agreement was going to happen 10 minutes from the blow-up last Friday, and I think it still will happen. How it will happen, I don't know. Perhaps the leaders of Europe or the foreign ministers of Europe and maybe Marco Rubio will be in the room instead of Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. I'm not sure, but I think it will happen. I don't think that is necessarily the end of this. It is a check mark, which will allow the president to say he got the deal he wanted, and Europe will agree with that, and Zelensky will agree with that. But then comes, how do we get to peace? And that requires making sure that Ukraine is in the strongest position possible to make the best deal possible with Russia. And it isn't yet. It needs more equipment, not just from Europe, but from us. And to remind, most of the dollars we've been sending Ukraine stay in the U.S. and pay for materiel that goes to Ukraine. So we're benefiting a lot right now financially from helping Ukraine. And the other point I would make is that this is freedom's door. Do we want to do something like Neville Chamberlain did in 1938 when he gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler and said, great, this is all you need, war over, and not so much. Do we want to give Ukraine to Russia and say, war over, and then lose Ukraine and lose Europe? Donald Trump doesn't like to lose. So I think he has a much better option, and it's going to be right there, and he can claim lots of credit, and the winner will be democracy.
Well, let's talk more about Europe. Keir Starmer hosted about 20 allies in London on Sunday. President Zelensky was there. They talked about forging a peace plan that could be offered to the administration. I wonder your thoughts on that. But listen to what the Prime Minister had to say about his country's plan to back Ukraine.
We are at a crossroads in history today. This is not a moment for more talk. It's time to act. The UK is prepared to back this. With boots on the ground and planes in the air, together with others, Europe must do the heavy lifting.
He's talking about a coalition of the willing. Jane, what does that mean without U.S. support? Is it possible?
Well, let's not assume it's without U.S. support. We were just talking about this. I think there will be U.S. support. There is lots of support for U.S. engagement in Congress, including by Republicans. And Marco
in what form,
Rubio,
though, I guess, Jane, would be my question. What form of support? Is this intelligence? Is it something more
let's go there in a minute. But I think there will. I think that Congress will also provide financial support. We may suspend it for a brief period and come back to it. But remember, most of this support stays in the U.S., so it seems crazy to pull it. Also, the Biden administration should have moved faster with the support. Let's go there. But Europe should and must step up. Keir Starmer is a grown-up. He's doing a great job representing his country and pulling Europe together. And this is interesting because after Brexit, the UK role kind of diminished, but now they're back. And I think that there will be more European support, and there will be troops offered, and there will be money. And there is this idea of borrowing against the enormous amount of frozen Russian assets, borrowing, not using the assets, but borrowing against that, which would generate billions more in aid. So I see this happening. I haven't been an optimist lately, but I'm an optimist about this. And I think Donald Trump will have lots of thank yous and lots of credit.
Well, as we consider, Congresswoman, your notion that Congress may still yet appropriate additional funds to Ukraine, last I checked, they're trying to work on a budget reconciliation package to achieve a litany of legislative objectives from the president. They have yet to figure out how to fund the government beyond 11 days from now on March 14th. You spent a lot of time in that chamber. When would they get around to appropriating more money to Ukraine?
Well, let's see what this budget deal looks like. This is reconciliation package. This is the outline. Let's see where it goes. And let's see what if Congress can actually pass a budget or whether it goes back to the tired old continuing resolution way of funding government, which funds to the last budget. When I looked, there was Ukraine aid in the last budget. Sadly, Congress needs to step up. Both sides of Congress need to step up. And Roger Wicker, who chairs the Senate Armed Services Committee, to me, has been enormously brave here and called out the administration and called out Marco Rubio for what he called rookie mistakes when Rubio spoke about Ukraine in Paris. And I think we could see leadership. I mean, losing democracy, losing freedom in the world is kind of high stakes. And Ukraine is the tip. You asked about intelligence. I'm worried about that. I'm worried about the announcement of the Secretary of Defense that offensive cyber efforts in Russia will now be halted. Russia and rogue actors in Russia have engaged in cyber operations against us. Before we go full out, for Russia, let's think about whether there's the possibility of attacks from Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and rogue actors in the United States because we're focused elsewhere. And I think another 9/11 is certainly a possibility if we take our eye off the ball. And I also think the Five Eyes, our five most important allies who share information with us, may be reconsidering, given some of the actions in the United States to reduce our intelligence capacity, to share the names of intelligence assets and things that I think are colossally counterproductive.
It's good to have you back, Jane. As always, Jane Harman, former Congresswoman, former chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. We thank you, as always. The fallout continuing, of course, from that meeting we've been talking about between Donald Trump and Zelensky, with big questions ahead of Donald Trump's speech tomorrow. The president, as we've told you, says the minerals deal is not dead. And that's where we start with our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, our Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to see you both here. A new week upon us and a big night tomorrow night. Rick, does Donald Trump need to make news on Ukraine?
Well, I think his entire speech is going to be making news, right? Regardless of whether it's on Ukraine or on tariffs or on the legislative package or taxes.
A lot of people saw that blow up on Friday, though, and wonder if there's a next chapter to this.
I think he's been very clear. I mean, I think he wants to do a deal, but I think he's going to, my impression from what he's saying is let's let Zelensky stew for a while. Look, it wasn't a good exit, right? I mean, they threw him out of the White House. Then he goes on Fox, doesn't really help himself on Fox, then goes to Europe and stands up with the king. Talk about a way to upset Donald Trump, right? He just got a letter to have a visit with the king, and there's Zelensky. Well, what's he doing there? I'm the one who got invited to see the king. I mean, like, you can just unravel the personal relationship on top of all the really important strategic elements of this and realize this has been a disaster and it's ongoing. Wow. Nothing is better today than it was that moment on Friday in the Oval Office.
Well, that moment on Friday actually was met with a lot of celebration in certain circles, Jeannie. The MAGA movement, those who believe in America first, were thrilled with what they saw, not just from the president, but from the vice president as well. The audience gathered in the joint session tomorrow, though, the actual lawmakers who make up Congress may actually feel differently, at least some of them. Certainly there are hawkish Republicans who take a different view on Ukraine. Do you expect that the president's tenor around all of this will change to reflect that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we talk about two Donald Trumps, the Donald Trump who's the prompter Donald Trump, who's a little bit more subdued, a little bit more appealing, if you can say, to the moderates. And then there's the Donald Trump off the cuff and the kind of Donald Trump we saw in the Oval Office. And what's going to be fascinating is who's behind him. Mike Johnson. Last year, Mike Johnson was willing to risk his entire speakership to support aid for Ukraine. Does he sit there tomorrow echoing what he's been saying since that meeting on Friday, which is this more MAGA wing, this more, pro-Putin, pro-Russian stance that we have a lot of shared interest there? Or does he revert to the Mike Johnson of before? And the entire Republican Party is in this position. You know, for a long time, Rick and I would talk, and Rick would remind me, almost all Republicans in Congress strongly supportive of aid for Ukraine, strongly supportive of Vladimir Zelensky. Are they going to sit there tomorrow and cheer if Donald Trump is echoing Putin and Russian talking points? So it's going to be fascinating how they get themselves out of this sort of, do we go with Trump or do we revert to who we were just a few months ago?
Boy, we have a lot to figure out here in the next 24 hours. That's a speech that's clearly still taking shape. Is there deal-making happening in the back channels between now and then?
Oh, for sure. I mean, a speech is a static document that you give one night, and then it starts and it stops and it's over, and it's already, old news by the next day. There are a lot of machinations going on. I mean, we've been really obsessed for the last 4 days with talking about, what's going on between Trump and Zelensky, Ukraine, and the United States and Europe. Hardly anybody's talking about, what's going on with the Russians. Remember, it was only a week ago we met with the Russians in Saudi Arabia, to the aghast of the entire world. Oh, my God, they're talking to Russians about peace. Well, how else do you get peace if you don't talk to the Russians? What else has been said to the Russians in the last week? I mean, they're applauding the disaster in the Oval Office. They think it's great stuff. They're probably doing, high fives in the Kremlin again today when they found out that the U.S. is going to stop attacking them on cyber. I don't know. I mean, I think the more interesting story today is not what you see in the press every 2 minutes about what Zelensky said about Trump, what Trump said about Zelensky. That's just deal making. I think what's really interesting is what's going on with Russia.
Good question. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino will be back with us later this hour. They'll also be with us for our Balance of Power special of President Trump's joint address to Congress. Coverage begins tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And we'll have more Balance of Power with Congressman Frank Lucas just ahead.
a government shutdown is not in the cards. I am fully against any shutdown. It does not serve any purpose and will not save us any money in the long run. So if a long-term CR, year-long CR, is what gets this across the finish line and keeps the government funded, I, of course, would support that.
Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York on Balance of Power last week on what it might take to avoid a government shutdown just 11 days from now. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Mike Dorning, who helps lead our congressional coverage. And Mike, those who've been with us here on Balance of Power for a while now might remember the end of last year when we were dealing with the December funding deadline. There was a live conversation taking place about a continuing resolution through the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. They decided to do March on purpose. And you're really telling me they might just do a continuing resolution to September 30th ultimately.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, and it boils down to neither side wants to be seen as responsible for shutting down the government. And so if they can sort of avoid having any kind of rioters that they're putting on it that one side could be blamed for, then it's harder to vote it down. And really, that means the Democrats giving up their best piece of leverage to try to do something to counteract Trump's executive moves.
Wow. Bloomberg Intelligence putting odds on a shutdown. 40% odds if it's a clean bill, 60% odds of a shutdown if, to your point, there are riders attached. Speaker Johnson knows this. He talked about a clean CR over the weekend. Even if Democrats, or I guess I should say with Democrats joining in that world, he could ostracize a good chunk of his own conference.
Yeah, I mean, you might have trouble getting all of the Democrats on board. I mean,
Sure.
if he can get most of his conference to go along, he can probably get some Democrats to go.
Does he pay a price for that? Pentagon hawks won't like it. Freedom Caucus won't like it.
Yeah, a lot of people won't like it, but what we've found out is that when Donald Trump gets on the phone, the people who don't like it and who are mad at Johnson go ahead and vote with him anyway. We saw that on his budget. There were 4 Republicans who were just dyed in the wool. They weren't going to take it. They thought Johnson was too weak on what he was asking for. Trump got on the phone with them, and enough of them went over to get it through.
Well, I do wonder, the House was able to get through, which surprised some last week, the blueprint for budget reconciliation, the outlining of what it will take to actually get further tax cuts and what spending cuts will come with it. The Senate has that now. Mike, what do we expect to happen next, considering the Senate didn't seem to be very fond of some measures of that?
Yeah, I suspect they'll change it. And I suspect then there's going to have to be some back and forth. I think the Senate Republicans want longer-term tax cuts. They want to do more on the tax front, and they don't want to do these painful Medicaid cuts that are going to look bad to have cutting people off of food assistance and getting rid of health insurance for poor people. So I think they'll just say, you know what, we'll have the big tax cuts. We won't. Bigger tax cuts, less spending cuts, that's all good. And then they'll have to get together with the House and figure out a compromise.
Mike, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Mike Dorning with us on Balance of Power as we now add the voice of a Republican member of Congress. We go live to Capitol Hill to speak with Congressman Frank Lucas of Oklahoma. He's a member of the House Financial Services Committee, and it's great to have you back, Congressman, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Maybe you could shed some light on this. If Speaker Johnson can, in fact, bring a clean CR to the floor, will it pass?
I think so. No one really wants a shutdown. Everyone realizes that the simple fact of the matter is you have a 2-seat Republican majority in the House, a 3-seat majority Republican body in the Senate. And it takes, other than reconciliation and judicial nominations, 60 votes in the United States Senate. This is probably where we were headed all along, no matter what my friends on the left and my friends on the right thought. But you can't, in the world we're operating in right now, in good faith, shut the place down. When would it ever reopen? How would it reopen?
Well, and certainly those questions are perhaps even more relevant when you already have the Department of Government Efficiency looking at trimming down the federal government and trying to shut down different agencies. The work of the DOJ is where a lot of the pushback from Democrats is emanating from, Congressman. Is there no world in which Congress is willing to do as the Democrats would like and put firm restraints on the president spending money as Congress appropriates it?
Well, bear in mind, DOGE is a creation of an executive order, and executive orders get tied up in court for months or years sometimes. We'll see how this sorts out. But having an efficiency examiner, consultant, however you want to describe it, going through the federal government is not a bad idea, but the decisions, the recommendations they made need to be thoughtful and careful, and we're working through that process now, both R's and D's alike.
Well, we're meeting on the eve of Tariff Tuesday, Congressman. We're still trying to get our heads around exactly what's going to happen tomorrow, but Donald Trump did speak about 25% levies against Canada and Mexico going into effect. He says there's no more room for them to get out of it. But he also talked about agriculture tariffs going into effect. And on the early edition of Balance of Power, we had a conversation about that with Liz Pancotti of the Groundwork Collaborative, about the impact that specifically these non-U.S. ag tariffs would have on American farmers. Here's what she said.
This could increase their fertilizer prices, the prices they pay for agricultural equipment, much of which is imported. And so even though you may have, increases in demand for domestically produced agriculture, much of our agriculture products right now are imported, especially things like food and groceries. The input costs for how much it costs to produce those is likely to rise, sort of limiting what farmers are able to do in terms of increasing supply.
Congressman, our viewers and listeners should know you have a degree in agricultural economics, so we couldn't have a better voice for this right now. I wonder your thoughts on what the long-term impact would be when it comes to prices and competition for U.S. farmers, but more so in the immediate term, how quickly they could ramp up production to fill that gap.
Well, first off, Joe, I do have a degree in agricultural economics. I'm a farmer by trade. I represent a district that sells cattle and pork and wheat and cotton into the world market. If we don't have a world market, we don't have a price. So exports are something I'm very sensitive about. But bear in mind, the old phrase in Oklahoma is appropriate. Donald Trump is a horse trader. He pushes, he pulls, he bluffs, he gets their attention. What will happen? I don't know over the course of the next few months, but I have product to sell into the world, and my constituents do, and energy products too. But the president says we have to have a more equitable, fair, reasonable trading environment around the world, and this is the baseball bat economically he's using. We're going to see what happens, and he's going to do exactly what he thinks is appropriate.
Well, if he's using a baseball bat, Congressman, then it leaves the question of what kind of damage it ultimately will do to the economy, be it the agricultural economy or more broadly when we're considering potential inflationary aspects to this and potential growth hits that could come if consumers are suddenly faced with higher prices and aren't willing to pay them. You are chair of the new task force on monetary policy, treasury market resilience, and economic prosperity. You're going to be having your first hearing on this tomorrow. How do these things translate ultimately into monetary policy?
Well, monetary policy is a critical thing, and we'll start a series of hearings tomorrow that address not just monetary policy, but how Treasury funds the debt, the securities market, all of those issues, of the Fed's oversight of the financial services industry, just a variety of topics. But we'll begin with monetary policy tomorrow, looking at how that's important. And I suspect to you there will be questions like, what's the fine line between the Fed's independence on monetary policy under the 1913 Act and with the authorities and requirements of Dodd-Frank and a number of other pieces of legislation? There's supervisory oversight. Even if you think the Fed should be independent, I suspect my colleagues will agree Congress has oversight authorities when the Fed is providing oversight to the financial services industry. That'll be part of it. There will be discussions about how a variety of things are financed. Do we have the focus where we need to be? But this is the opening round of a very bright group of Republicans and Democrats alike looking at where we go. Monetary policy now, Treasury debt after that, just a variety of topics. And by the way, some of the arguments would be made that with the trade policies we've had, a lot of our fertilizer production has gone offshore because we were unfairly disadvantaged here. So there's a number of things that President Trump, I should say respectfully, is trying to correct and address.
Congressman Elon Musk yesterday went on X and called the central bank absurdly overstaffed. Is that true? Is it time to clean out the Fed?
Well, I suspect the way my friend Elon Musk is going about this, he'll find that there are a variety of places where there are things that he believes are insufficiently tight. But that said, you got to have the people to do the jobs, and that's what we're watching now. Do we have enough people in positions of responsibility providing the services that are needed by Americans all across the country? Everything Elon does is going to be subject to review. Everything will be subject to lawsuits. But having someone ask the questions, stir the cobwebs, there's nothing wrong with that. They just need to do it in a thoughtful, methodical fashion that is more positive than negative. And we'll see.
All right, and we'll see what comes of that hearing tomorrow. We're looking forward to finding out more. Republican Congressman Frank Lucas of Oklahoma, thank you so much. And coming up, President Trump says tomorrow night will be big. We'll preview his address to a joint session of Congress with our signature political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Is the Ukraine minerals deal now dead, or can it be revived?
Well, I'll let you know. We're making a speech. You probably heard about it tomorrow night, so I'll let you know tomorrow night.
President Trump teeing up his joint address to Congress tomorrow night, saying he'll share more about what's next for the Ukraine minerals deal. And I'm sure he's going to be sharing a lot more about a lot else as well. Back with us for a preview of his remarks is our signature political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shan Zaino. So obviously we talked about the way in which geopolitics may feature into this speech already. But by and large, Jeannie, this is going to be for the domestic audience, right? It's for Congress and everybody watching at home. At a time when polls are suggesting that there is a feeling among the American electorate that the president is not focusing enough on their immediate economic reality. How do you expect him to address that tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, we just saw the polls, CBS, CNN, NPR, just in the last 48 hours, all of them and others showing that there is a majority of Americans who feel that he's sort of taken his eye off the main reason he got into office, which was to address prices. And of course, we're talking about tomorrow when he has promised to put in these massive tariffs against our closest neighbors and allies that sent the stock market down today. So you'd think that he would come in and say that his eye is still on the ball of costs and then also immigration. And those are his two main priorities. Even on Truth Social today, you can see him trying to make that case. But then there's, of course, the Donald Trump that goes off script and, you know, says that I am right, that tariffs are beautiful and we're going to keep them and inflation won't be an issue. And so, you know, you can't predict what he's going to do. But all I know, as Rick Davis told me earlier today, President Trump has promised this will be a bigly speech. So it's going to be a big night.
Well, you know, we started tonight with Romaine in Bostick in New York talking about the fact that the S&P 500 saw its biggest sell-off of the year so far. Donald Trump surely doesn't like that. Not the day before he stands before the American people. Rick, what are the odds that we get a deal announced with Canada and Mexico? Market rallies, take credit in the speech. Is this all part of the process?
Yeah, I certainly think that's what he wants to have happen. He's got to have willing participants, right? What are they getting for this? Because they've been putting up with 5 weeks of just getting hammered on threats, and they seem pretty prepared to fight. So his ability to get a deal would be worth crowing about, because it's certainly not conditions to do it. But I actually, the one thing I would say is I think this speech is going to be more about the world and less about America, right? He'll talk about oil prices down, gas prices down. That's his one victory on consumer issues. He won't spend a lot of time on stuff he's not doing well on. That I promise. And yet the biggest speech that's been given in this administration so far was J.D. Vance's speech at Munich Security Conference a week ago, you know, where he laid out a completely different vision of how the world's power system was going to work. And I wouldn't be surprised to hear that echoed in tomorrow night's speech with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is in the middle of every geopolitical fight on the face of the earth tonight. And tomorrow night he's going to talk about those things too.
Well, so then other than Ukraine, what would you expect him to address? Is this going to be a conversation about the Middle East and a ceasefire that technically expired but is being in some way extended between Israel and Hamas? Is it going to be about China and countering that
I
threat?
think all of the above. He's going to talk about the beautiful Gaza development that he has in his mind. He's going to talk about the great partnership he has with Israel and putting a lot of pressure on Iran because of the roll-up of all these terrorist groups. He's going to talk about China, and, he's just done this deal with TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor business today. He's going to talk about how, they need to keep their hands off of Taiwan and that, tariff. He's talking about significantly, potentially increasing the tariffs on China. I think he's going to shout out for Russia. I mean, everything we've seen in the last 2 weeks has been Putin, Putin, Putin. I mean, tell me he's not going to bring Putin up in his speech tonight or tomorrow night?
It is Russia, Russia,
when you
Russia.
say it 3 times in a row.
Yeah, he might magically appear. Jeannie, Democrats are going to be there tomorrow night, almost as many of them as Republicans. Some actually are boycotting, like Chris Murphy, we understand, the senator from Connecticut. But most will be bringing guests, as we tend to see lawmakers bring a special guest, make a little news maybe with your local media. They're bringing a lot of laid-off federal workers. Will it make an impact? Will anyone care?
I don't know if that's going to have a huge impact. I think we will see that. Democrats are still trying to figure out how to respond to this first 6 weeks of the Trump administration. You've got the Chris Murphys who are saying we must respond. We must not play into this. This is going to be a MAGA speech. He said, I'm not going to participate. Then you have others like Nancy Pelosi, the Washington Post this weekend, who said, don't do anything to draw attention to yourself. Let him do his thing and implode himself, essentially wait for the midterms. So I think we're going to see a variety of different responses. It's going to be interesting to see who else boycotts beyond Chris Murphy. But can I just say about what Rick said? If Donald Trump does focus on Putin, which, by the way, is like Brady Bunch, right? That's like a Marsha. If he does, this is a huge miss for him. And this is a huge gain for Democrats. Americans voted him in very narrowly to focus on 2 things, costs and immigration and security. If his entire focus is not on the U.S., but is on the rest of the world, that is a huge miss on a speech in which is going to garner him the biggest audience he will see for the next year. So he may do it, you may be right, but he should not do that. He should focus on what got him there and promise to deliver more, which, as the polls you mentioned, Kayleigh, early on are showing that that's starting to slip already.
Well, and he's going to want to talk about tax cuts, right? He's staring down the body that has to make it happen.
Yeah, well, look, he just got a package passed that indicates that his tax cuts are going to get approved, certainly by the House and probably by the Senate. So, of course, he's going to make his appeal for his legislative agenda. But, in the past, when he's done this in his first term, he had to make an appeal to get Congress to do it. It's a different relationship with Congress now. He tells Congress what to do. And so that is a completely different communication than what happened in his first term. And so I think you will see that I will get my tax cuts. I will get the things that I want out of Congress. To him, Congress is a big staff operation. They're not an independent body. He believes in a very strong executive branch and that we ought to get in the executive branch anything we want from Congress.
Last couple of these have been the night at the Coliseum, a lot of yelling, people wearing certain clothes to get captured on video. There's the image of Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene will go down in history. Jeannie, are Democrats going to be loaded for bear like that? You mentioned Nancy Pelosi. She's telling people to keep it cool. No more ripping speeches this year.
She is. I guess she learned from her own experience. Don't rip any speeches. That's what she's saying. But, you're curious to see if people are going to listen. It only takes one to violate that. And there is a lot of push on the Democratic side and in the base that Democrats are not stepping up and pushing back enough. And let's not forget, this is 2 hours on live television. You want to make your mark, this is the place to do it. So you may find a Democrat or two who doesn't want to miss that opportunity. It's hard to tell.
Well, and a lot of this is going to fall to the new senator, Elissa Slotkin.
That's right. That's right. And boy, she's got a tough role to play. But I think she's a very good person to do this. National security background from Michigan. She is a person who's been able to win in a state that has gone for Trump. So she is a good person to do this. no kitchens, no waters. There's a lot of things to avoid in these speeches, and she knows all of that.
Watch the chapstick. What's your advice for Senator Slotkin tomorrow night?
God, don't do the speech. Nobody succeeds.
It never happens,
It's
right?
a disaster waiting to happen, and it's going to happen with her, too. I mean, honestly, she's not going to be the exception to the rule.
Boy, that's tough, Kaylee.
I wonder who will play her on SNL the following week, as we saw with ScarJo and Katie Britt last year.
Yeah, right. So this is the new
Just don't
cover
put her
of
in a
Wheaties
kitchen or a living room. Put her behind a desk and somewhere in the Capitol.
Fantastic. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano will, of course, be with us, as we mentioned, for our special coverage tomorrow. That'll be 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you both so much, as always, for the conversation. We'll meet you back here for a big day in Washington. Coming up, we'll look ahead to what we can expect in politics the next 24 hours. I think we may have just given you a taste. There's more ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Thanks for being with us as we look ahead to a big day. The Super Bowl of politics is tomorrow. And in just the next 24 hours, it's not only the president's address to a joint session. Canada and Mexico tariffs set to go into effect technically tonight, an additional 10% on China as well. That's already, Kaylee, been signed by the president.
Yeah, amending the language in his first order to take the tariffs from 10% to 20% on all Chinese goods. Of course, for Mexico and Canada, the level's 25%. Yep. Canadian energy, 10%. We have about 6 hours to go until the midnight deadline, and the president suggested no deal is going to be able to be made in time.
Pretty remarkable moment today. A lot of folks were thinking that this would be more fluid after Howard Lutnick used that actual word in a conversation with Fox News. That doesn't mean that they will stay in effect forever, though, and we're just going to have to wait to hear what he tells us. This will, of course, be part of the big speech tomorrow night that Kaylee coincides with China's National People's Congress annual meeting. I suspect they'll be listening.
Well, yeah, they're going to be outlining growth targets for China, an economy that now is going to have to contend with potentially exporting less to the United States. It's going to be fascinating. And of course, yes, a very interesting split screen as President Trump also gets set to speak to Congress tomorrow for an unknown period of time. Probably going to be a pretty lengthy one, if we had to guess. Yes, we will be here for the duration on Balance of Power. Special coverage of that address beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern Time right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.